Recent books, like How to Hide an Empire, have raised the question of great power politics in modern times. While these books usually make a moral argument condemning empire, I wanted to look at this topic from a different perspective. If we invoke Machiavelli's line from The Prince and look at the world as it is, and not as we wish it to be, we have to make room for power. The politics of power, political realism, is an innate part of history, life, and foreign policy. While we can aspire for another world where humans advance holistically, the daily reality is that we're divided into civilizations, nations, and ethnicities. The thesis of political idealism, that we can take power relations out of foreign policy, is a privilege of our time. The fact we can even discuss it is a product of the United States being the current era's moral and economic hegemon. If we study the empires of the past, from Assyria to Macedon to Rome, we can learn from them and apply their lessons to the present. When we study even the most democratic powers, like ancient Athens, we find it engaged in imperialism and looked after its self-interest. When I studied Macedon under Philip II, I learned how imperialistic and aggressive Athens was, continually interfering in the internal affairs of another power. I found it interesting, as it showed that democracies conduct themselves according to the ideas of realism too. Athens turned the Delian League into a vassal, brought its treasury from Delos to Attica, disciplined league members who tried to leave its empire, and embarked on aggressive expeditions to Egypt and Syracuse. The United States, as another democratic country, has done similarly unsavory things, most famously its assassination of the Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, in the 1950s. To unpack the topic of the American Empire, we have to go back to the 20th century. One way to understand World War II is the three-way war between different ideologies. These ideologies fought in a global conflict for the future of humanity. During the war, this was a military conflict, and during the Cold War, it transformed into an economic one. One ideology was the nihilistic, racial, Darwinist view of Hitler, which we explored in detail in a previous video. The Russians came up with an alternative view. They had their own secular prophet, Lenin. He presented a different Marxist vision of the future, one where the international working class unified politically against the tyranny of the rich. The Americans presented a third vision. Starting with the political system of the founders, the Great Depression caused the country to enter into its worst crisis, with the economic collapse destroying the fortunes of most of the population and souring the people on capitalism. Roosevelt emerged as a redemptive figure, promising a new relationship between the forces of labor and capital. If we analyze the effects of each of these ideologies, we can discern their real consequences. Both Hitlerism and Leninism suppressed individual liberties and created authoritarian regimes. Both used fear to suppress individual free expression. Hitler's ideology resulted in the murders of millions, began a war that destroyed Europe, and ultimately resulted in the ruin of Germany. Lenin's ideology produced a police state that oppressed its own population. Media, art, and religion were obscured. Promising a material utopia, the Soviet system was unable to create wealth and couldn't compete with the American system. While the Americans surged forward after the Second World War, the Soviets lagged behind with the rest of the Second World. The Soviet system proved rigid and inflexible, and rather than adapt to reform Marx's beliefs, it simply collapsed when its tenets proved unsound. This three-way conflict, which we can view as humanity trying to come up with an organizing principle, resulted in the U.S. system demonstrating itself as the fittest. Instead of pursuing a utopia like its competitors, the Americans embraced democracy and self-determination as its sources of moral legitimacy. It accepted wealth inequality, though under Roosevelt tried to mediate it through forms of welfare. Ultimately, its system brought long-term economic growth, which resulted in its working classes doing better than their peers elsewhere. When the Iron Curtain collapsed in 1991 and the American system was triumphant, there was a brief period of the so-called end of history, a time when it wasn't clear what the future held or if the old rules of power or empire would return. As the 21st century proceeded, particularly with the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War, we see that history hasn't stopped but continues. We see that power and great power politics persist in the modern world. To understand the American Empire, you have to start with the power that came before it, the British Empire. These two states have a lot in common. They're two Anglophone empires, control the world's sea lanes, promote global development, and embrace private property and capitalism. Our modern trading system starts with the British. With the accession of William and Mary in the 17th century, under Dutch influence, the Royal Navy moved to the goal of protecting the world's sea lanes. By doing this, it facilitated the integration of trade between Europe and the rest of the world, particularly the East. Over time, tariffs diminished, and in the Victorian period, the major powers began embracing free trade as an idea. In the interests of global commerce, the British promoted friendly relations with the other maritime powers, at different points signing alliances with France, the United States, and Japan. This system of Atlantic trade was extremely successful in creating wealth for its constituents. The Germans and later the Japanese made an effort to challenge this system, embracing the idea of autarky, or economic self-reliance, as an alternative. With the defeat of the fascist powers at the end of World War II, this challenge came to an end, and the global trade system prevailed. So let's unpack the elements of the American Empire: global trade, military hegemony, and international organizations. 1. Global trade. After World War II, the British passed the imperial baton to the United States, which was a unique event in history. One English-speaking superpower handed world leadership to another. This was in theory the most benign end for the British, representing their loss of imperial glory, but ensuring a continuity of their Anglophone culture and values, and continuing to lead the world. The dismantling of Imperial Britain was a major transformation. While Nazi Germany had to be defeated through force, the British presided over a voluntary step-down from empire. They abdicated from a Darwinist, racialist view of the world, realizing that the countries they colonized had developed their own senses of statehood and national consciousness, and wanted to pursue their destinies independently. From the British policies of colonization and global trade, the Americans adapted and built a new system. Taking the vision of Alfred Thayer Mahan, author of The Influence of Sea Power on History, the Americans realized the power of their navy for leading the world. Mahan argued that whoever ruled the world's oceans would be able to manage the trade of other powers. He observed how maritime states, like Athens and Holland, prospered from the efficiencies promoted by trade. With the Royal Navy diminished, the U.S. decided to take on its mantle as the new naval superpower. Having defeated Japan and built a fleet of battleships and aircraft carriers, the U.S. was able to guarantee the global system of trade. This system promoted economic development and encouraged countries to specialize their economies based on what they were most adapted to. One benefit of this system of economic interdependence was it was a way of avoiding war. The more integrated the global economy was, the harder it would be for nations to fall out with one another and end up at war with each other. While decolonization proceeded under the Americans, it didn't diminish nations' access to resources. With international corporations, companies could freely enter foreign countries and access the resources there. 2. Military hegemony. We live in the age of the so-called Pax Americana, or the age of peace under the military hegemony of the United States. If you study history, these periods of general peace have emerged whenever one state has become a superpower. Prior examples include those of the Romans, the Mongols, and the British. While if you live in Iraq or Afghanistan, you may not have a positive view of this, if you live elsewhere, you may perceive it differently. Europe was embroiled in constant conflict over the centuries. From the War of the Spanish Succession to the 7 Years' War to the Great War, this pattern of cyclical conflict has come to an end. The loss of life from interstate conflict has diminished dramatically in our time period, with the exception recently of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Nuclear weapons. A key part of the American hegemony is due to the rise of nuclear weapons. These weapons have such an immense destructive power that they've changed the nature of politics. Once a state has nuclear weapons, they're no longer able to fight another nuclear power in a conventional war. Doing so would result in annihilation. What this means is the world wants to be a meaner place, but is not able to be. Instead, modern states fight via proxy wars and supportive factions in other countries, like the different sides backed by foreign powers in the Syrian civil war. Air power. A final pillar of American hegemony lies in its air force. An extension of the Alfred Thayer Mahan thesis: if your country can't protect its own airspace, then it's de facto under the hegemony of the American Air Force. This creates a unique situation for the United States. It discourages smaller powers from going to war. If they do, at any time they could suffer an air or sea intervention by the Americans. This is one of the cynical forces that helps maintain peace in the world. 3. International organizations. In a previous video, we talked about the Habsburg Empire and how marriage was a tool they used to bring diverse countries together under one ruler. Our modern system seems to lack a mechanism of political integration, instead preferring countries to stay atomized and independent. On closer inspection, though, this is not the case, and the world remains as dynamic as ever, but in a new way. In the U.S. system, international agreements and organizations fulfill the historical role of personal unions. Today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the alliance of the Western democracies with the U.S., plays a hegemonic role in the world. In terms of empire, NATO is an example of how modern empire works. It's similar in function to the Peloponnesian or Delian leagues of ancient Greece, with constituent members retaining their independence, but joining together in an alliance of shared values and governance. The American empire doesn't rule others directly, but indirectly. It relies on soft power and on its military and economic dominance to distinguish it in the world. America's allies retain their autonomy and benefit from economic integration with the United States. In the past, such as under the Roman Empire, these states would inevitably become subjects of the superpower. But our modern system of empire is more benign than this, and tries instead to create a co-equal world. Language. One aspect to consider in the soft power of the United States is to see the rise of English as a language throughout the world. While nations retain their primary language, in order to engage in diplomacy and business, there's an incentive to become Anglophone. Once one speaks this language, one can consume English media and culture and become gradually assimilated into the psychological system of the United States. Our world and data. While people like to condemn the U.S. system, when you examine the data, we're living in one of the best eras of human civilization. While in the past you had to contend with short lifespans, foreign invasion, disease, poverty, malnourishment, and illiteracy, all these phenomena have improved dramatically since 1945. We're living in an era where deaths by violent conflict are at some of their lowest, where lifespans have increased considerably, and where real poverty has diminished by a huge amount. People would be reticent to call our era a golden age, but when compared with the condition of humanity in previous time periods, it is. One of the ironies of the 20th century is that capitalism did the most to improve the lives of common people throughout the world. When India achieved independence after World War II and sought an economic theory to bring its people out of poverty, it decided to emulate the economy of the Soviet Union. Doing this in the 1950s and onward, its state-run policies didn't bear fruit. Observing the successes of the market shift made by China in the 80s and the 90s, the Indians decided to adopt a model closer to that of the United States. Not only India, but countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Poland, and Hungary have benefited by joining the American-led world. Opponents. Challengers to the U.S. system, namely Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, find themselves in a difficult situation. While they're still able to trade and participate in the global economy, without integrating into the U.S.-led system, they usually find themselves at an economic disadvantage. For these nations, their state of self-reliance and defiance has to be worth the economic cost of opposing the United States. The Americans themselves engage in a form of moral imperialism, which has worked in Europe and East Asia, but failed elsewhere. They try to spread their values and governing principles to their allies and satellites. This results in the spread of democratic liberties and constitutions. This has worked successfully in the Christian world, for example in Czechia, Italy, and Poland. It has also worked in the Confucian world, in countries like Taiwan and South Korea. However, this process has failed elsewhere, like in the Islamic world where the Americans tried to create democracies, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Challenges: wealth inequality. One of the challenges of the U.S. system is the problem of wealth inequality. In the American economy, your goal should be to amass assets until you have enough where the appreciation of your assets can replace your income. When you reach this level of being able to live off your investments, you become a member of the American aristocracy. Because assets appreciate over the long term, the only way you can fall out of this class is through excessive consumption. The American aristocracy is accessible as it doesn't have barriers to entry like the heredity of historical systems. At the same time, there's a profound difference between those born into wealth, or those who have financial support, and those who are born without these advantages. As the American economy has embraced technology, many reliable jobs of the middle class have come under duress. Consequently, the society has diverged. There was a great contraction of wealth and income in the country after World War II. This is mostly reversed, however, and in our times we're returning to distributions more similar to the 1920s. Challenges: demographics. While decades ago we feared an overpopulated world, a world where we'd run out of resources, today we're in the opposite situation. Economic development, improved education, reduced mortality, and sexual equality have changed attitudes towards sex and procreation. Marriage ages have been delayed till later, and birth rates have declined. Today, demographers are interested in a number called the replacement rate, 2.1 children per couple, which is necessary to maintain a stable population. If births drop below this, populations contract and decline. If you've ever seen the population pyramids of nations, we're entering an unprecedented time. Historically, these charts were shaped as pyramids, with fewer older people and more younger people, with disruptions caused by war, disease, or famine. Today, these pyramids are becoming lopsided as young generations shrink due to fewer and smaller families. One of the vehicles of economic growth is an increase of population, which leads to increased consumption over time. One hope is that technology will be able to compensate for this loss, but we'll have to see how it plays out over time. We can look at Japan over the next decades to get a sense of the future. The Japanese economy grew spectacularly in the 80s and 90s, sparking fears it would eclipse the United States. However, Japan's success halted in the mid-90s, causing it to enter a long period of stagnation. As one of the oldest countries in the world, with one of the lowest replacement rates, the future of Japan helps show us the fate of the world. While in the short term, immigration can make up for a lower birth rate, eventually the replacement rate takes over. Immigration means the U.S. will enjoy a period of continued growth for some time, giving it a window where it can observe how other nations deal with the demographic transition. Conclusion: the American empire is different from the territorial empires of the past. It is an economic, cultural, and military hegemon, exerting its influence more through soft power and alliances than through direct control. It maintains itself through trade, its naval and air power, its nuclear arsenal, and its Anglophone culture. The U.S. spreads its influence through media, the English language, and international organizations. While people criticize the American empire, it's the best era we've had of human civilization. We're in a state of relative global peace, with medical, social, educational, and material improvements for much of the world. At the same time, we are living in a nihilistic age, where a decline of religion and meaning has left us foundering for purpose and ideas that we can use to organize our lives. So the thesis here is that empire is inevitable. It simply exists. It's a consequence of power existing in the world. If you compare the United States with the powers of the past, from Assyria to Macedon to Mongolia, it's the most benign empire the world has had.